A debt of a secret. Lady Eleanor of Winthorne had once been Sir Tristan de Warwick's promised bride until war changed everything. Now, years later, he stood in her father's hall, watching her with an unreadable expression. His voice was low, rough. "Tell me, Eleanor," he murmured. "Do you still dream of what we once were?" Chapter 1. The Ghost of Promises Past. The great hall of Winthorne Castle felt colder than the November winds that howled outside, despite the roaring fire in the massive hearth. Eleanor, Lady of Winthorne, watched the flames dance, their flickering light mimicking the turbulent emotions churning within her. 10 years. 10 years since she had last seen him, and yet, the image of Sir Tristan de Warwick, younger, his eyes full of laughter and a future she believed they would share, was as vivid as if he stood before her then. He did stand before her now, though, a ghost made flesh, a specter from a past she had tried, and failed, to bury. He was different, of course. The boyish charm had been replaced by a hardened edge, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by time and, she suspected, by sorrow. His dark hair, once a wild, untamed mane, was now neatly cropped, threaded with the faintest hint of silver at the temples. He was broader, too, his shoulders bearing the weight of years spent in armor, in battle, a warrior honed by conflict. But his eyes, those hadn't changed. The same deep, unsettling blue, the color of a stormy sea, held her captive, just as they had a decade ago. Eleanor smoothed the fabric of her kirtle, a rich velvet the color of deep burgundy, a futile attempt to calm her racing heart. Her father, Lord Alaric, a man whose presence usually filled the hall with an air of unwavering authority, seemed strangely subdued, his gaze flitting between Tristan and herself. The other assembled guests, neighboring lords and ladies, knights of the realm, and household staff were silent, their attention riveted on the scene unfolding before them. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the weight of history and the uncertainty of the present. Tristan had arrived unannounced, a messenger preceding him by mere hours, bearing the crest of House de Warwick, a silver falcon on a field of black, and a sealed letter for her father. The contents of that letter remained a mystery to Eleanor, but the tension radiating from Lord Alaric was palpable. He had aged considerably in the past decade. The vibrant red of his hair was now mostly gray, and the lines on his face were more deeply etched. But his eyes, the same shade of piercing blue as Eleanor's, still held the spark of a warrior, albeit one tempered by time and loss. "Sir Tristan," Lord Alaric finally spoke, his voice strong but laced with a subtle tremor. "Welcome to Winthorne. It has been a long time." Tristan inclined his head, a gesture of respect that seemed almost formal, distant. "Lord Alaric." "It has indeed." His gaze shifted to Eleanor, and a flicker of something pain, regret, crossed his features before he masked it with an impassive expression. "My daughter, Eleanor," Lord Alaric continued, gesturing towards her. "You remember her, I presume?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Remember her? As if he could ever forget. Eleanor held her breath, her fingers clenching the fabric of her gown. Tristan's gaze intensified, holding hers with an unwavering force. "How could I forget Lady Eleanor?" His voice was low, rough, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine despite the years that had passed. He paused, and then, with a deliberate, almost cruel, softness, he added, "Tell me, Eleanor, do you still dream of what we once were?" The question was a blade, twisting in a wound she thought had long since scarred over. Memories flooded her, the stolen kisses in the apple orchard, the whispered promises under a summer moon, the day he had ridden off to war, leaving her with a ring and a vow that had been shattered by the cruel hand of fate. She had dreamed, yes, dreamed of a life that was now a distant, painful echo. Eleanor lifted her chin, her pride, her only armor in this unexpected confrontation. "I dream of many things, Sir Tristan," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "The past, however, is not one I dwell upon." It was a lie. The past was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to her, reminding her of what she had lost, of what she had been forced to become. A widow, at the age of 28, married off to Lord Edmund of Blackwood, a man twice her age, for political expediency, a pawn in her father's game of alliances. Edmund was gone now, 2 years dead from a fever that had swept through the land, leaving her mistress of Blackwood, a vast estate she ruled with a firm hand and a heavy heart. Tristan's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. A pragmatic answer, my lady. Fitting for the mistress of Blackwood. The title, spoken with a subtle emphasis, felt like an accusation. He knew, of course, of her marriage, of the circumstances that had led to it. He knew everything, and yet, he stood there, judging her, dredging up the past with his carefully chosen words. It is the answer I must give, Eleanor responded, her gaze unwavering. Life, as you well know, Sir Tristan, rarely follows the paths we dream of. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the wind. Lord Alaric cleared his throat, a signal that the private war being waged between his daughter and his former ward was to be set aside, at least for the moment. Sir Tristan, he said, you are welcome to stay at Winthorne for as long as you require. Your rooms have been prepared. Tristan bowed his head again. I thank you for your hospitality, Lord Alaric. I will not impose upon you for long. His words were polite, but Eleanor sensed an underlying current of something. Unease? Determination? She couldn't quite decipher it, but it sent a fresh wave of apprehension through her. His presence here, after all these years, was no accident. There was a purpose behind his return, a purpose that remained shrouded in mystery, a purpose that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed fabric of her life once more. And as she looked into those deep blue eyes, she knew that the ghost of promises past had returned to haunt her, and this time, she might not survive its embrace. The wind outside picked up, howling like a banshee. Chapter 2. A stranger in her father's hall. The evening meal was a strained affair. Eleanor sat at the high table, her father on one side, Tristan on the other. The distance between them felt vast, a chasm carved by years of silence and unspoken accusations. The hall, usually filled with the boisterous laughter and chatter of her father's court, was subdued, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Every clink of silver against porcelain, every murmured word, seemed amplified, echoing the turmoil within Eleanor's heart. Tristan, she noticed, ate sparingly, his gaze often drifting towards the darkened windows, as if he were looking for something or someone beyond the walls of Winthorne. He spoke little, answering her father's questions with polite brevity, his focus seemingly elsewhere. It was unnerving, this detachment, this sense that he was present in body but not in spirit. The young man she had known, the one who had filled her days with laughter and light, was gone, replaced by this enigmatic stranger, a warrior hardened by battles she could only imagine. She tried to focus on the conversation around her, on the mundane details of courtly life, but her mind kept returning to Tristan, to the questions that swirled unanswered. Why had he come? What did he want? And why, after all these years, did his presence still have the power to unsettle her so completely? She picked at her food, the roasted pheasant and spiced wine tasting like ash in her mouth. Her appetite, usually hearty, had vanished, replaced by a knot of anxiety that tightened with each passing moment. She stole glances at Tristan, trying to decipher the emotions hidden behind his stoic facade. His profile was sharp, defined, the strong line of his jaw hinting at a stubbornness she remembered well. His hands, resting on the table, were large and calloused, the hands of a warrior, not the gentle hands that had once held hers with such tenderness. Eleanor, her father's voice broke through her thoughts. You are quiet tonight. She forced a smile. Forgive me, father. I am merely preoccupied. With Sir Tristan's arrival, no doubt, Lord Alaric said, his gaze shrewd. It is understandable. It has been a long time. Indeed, Eleanor agreed, her voice carefully neutral. She wouldn't give her father, or Tristan, the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his return had affected her. Sir Tristan has been serving the king, Lord Alaric continued, addressing Tristan directly. With distinction, I hear. Tristan inclined his head. I have done my duty, my lord. Duty, Eleanor murmured, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. Duty had been the wedge that had driven them apart, the altar upon which their love had been sacrificed. His duty to his king, her father's duty to his lands, her own duty to her family. Tristan's eyes met hers, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Duty is a heavy burden, Lady Eleanor, he said softly, but one we must all bear. She knew he was speaking of more than just military service. He was speaking of the choices they had both made, the paths they had been forced to take. He was reminding her of the vows they had broken, of the promises that had been shattered by the harsh realities of their world. The conversation drifted to other matters: the recent skirmishes on the northern border, the king's upcoming visit to a neighboring shire, the latest gossip from the royal court. Eleanor listened, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the day, searching for clues, for answers. As the meal drew to a close, she excused herself, pleading a headache. The truth was, she could no longer bear the weight of Tristan's presence, the suffocating tension that filled the hall. She needed to be alone, to sort through the jumble of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She retreated to her chambers, a spacious room at the top of the west tower, overlooking the sprawling grounds of Winthorne. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, mirroring the storm raging within her. She dismissed her ladies-in-waiting, seeking solitude in the flickering candlelight. She walked to the window, gazing out at the darkness. The moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, casting the landscape in an eerie, ethereal glow. She could see the faint outline of the forest that bordered the estate, the trees swaying in the wind like restless spirits. She thought of the day Tristan had left 10 years ago. She had stood at this very window, watching him ride away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the distance. She had believed, with all the naive certainty of youth, that he would return, that their love would conquer all. But war had changed everything. A letter had arrived months later, bearing the dreaded news. Tristan had been captured, held prisoner by the enemy. Her father, fearing for his own position, had arranged her marriage to Lord Edmund, a strategic alliance that would strengthen his defenses. She had fought, pleaded, begged, but to no avail. Her fate had been sealed. She had never stopped loving Tristan, not truly. But she had learned to bury her feelings, to build a wall around her heart, to protect herself from the pain of what might have been. And now, he was back, a stranger in her father's hall, a reminder of everything she had lost. A soft knock on the door startled her. She turned, her heart pounding. "Who is it?" "It is I, Eleanor." Tristan's voice. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. She wasn't ready to face him, not yet. But she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. She took a deep breath, composing herself. "Enter," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He opened the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind him. The room suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, the air thick with unspoken emotions. He stood there, silhouetted against the candlelight, his face in shadow. He removed his heavy, fur-lined cloak and tossed it aside. "I apologize for intruding, my lady," he said, his voice low and husky. "But I needed to speak with you. Alone." The fire in the hearth crackled. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unspoken Words. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to ward off the sudden chill that had settled over her, a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind whistling outside. Tristan's presence in her private chambers, after all these years, after all that had passed between them, felt both incredibly intimate and profoundly unsettling. "What is it you wish to say, Sir Tristan?" she asked, her voice betraying a tremor she couldn't quite control. She moved towards the fireplace, seeking the warmth of the flames, a small, instinctive act of self-preservation. He followed, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to feel the heat emanating from his body, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to him, a scent that evoked a flood of bittersweet memories. "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words seeming to come with difficulty. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Apologize? For what?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "For the way I spoke to you in the hall. For dredging up the past." "The past is a part of us, Sir Tristan," she replied softly. "We cannot simply erase it." He turned back to her, his eyes, usually so guarded, now filled with a raw vulnerability that took her breath away. "I know. But I had no right to speak to you as I did. It was unfair." "Unfair?" Eleanor echoed, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "Life is unfair, Sir Tristan. We both know that." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I never stopped thinking about you, Eleanor. Not for a single day." The words, spoken with such raw honesty, sent a shiver down her spine. She had tried to convince herself that he had forgotten her, that she had been nothing more than a fleeting youthful fancy. But his words, his eyes, told a different story. "And yet, you did not write," she said, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. He flinched, as if struck by a physical blow. I couldn't. I was a prisoner, Eleanor. For years. And when I was finally released, I learned of your marriage." The pain in his voice was palpable, a mirror of her own long-buried grief. She had imagined him dead, mourned him as lost. The reality, that he had been alive, suffering, and then, learning of her marriage, it was almost too much to bear. "I had no choice," she whispered, the words a familiar refrain, a mantra she had repeated to herself countless times over the years. "My father, he arranged the marriage. I was powerless." "Powerless?" He repeated the word with a hint of scorn. "We always have a choice, Eleanor. It may not be the choice we want, but it is a choice nonetheless." His words stung, but she knew they held a grain of truth. She could have refused, could have defied her father. But the consequences, the thought of her family's ruin, of the potential for war, it had been too much to risk. "And what choice did you have, Sir Tristan?" She challenged him, her voice rising. "Did you choose to be captured? Did you choose to leave me to face my fate alone?" He closed his eyes, his face etched with pain. "No," he whispered. "I did not choose those things. But I chose to survive. I chose to live, even when I had nothing left to live for." His words struck a chord within her, a deep resonance of shared pain and resilience. She, too, had chosen to survive, to rebuild her life from the ashes of her shattered dreams. "And now?" she asked softly. "What do you choose now?" He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. "I choose to understand. To understand what happened. To understand you." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He wanted more than just an explanation. He wanted to reconnect, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But could they? Could they ever truly overcome the years of separation, the betrayals, the wounds that ran so deep? She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. I do not know if that is possible, Sir Tristan." He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers, not quite touching. "We owe it to ourselves, Eleanor. To the memory of what we once were to try." His touch, even the mere proximity of his hand, sent a wave of warmth through her, a warmth that both comforted and terrified her. She was drawn to him, pulled by a force she couldn't deny, and yet she was afraid of reopening old wounds, of risking the fragile peace she had built for herself. She looked into his eyes and saw not the stranger he was, but the man he had been. And in that instant, she felt the stone wall around heart begin to crumble. The wind outside shifted and held a different tone. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Lost Spring. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze fixed on Tristan's outstretched hand, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air between them. The warmth of his near touch radiated through her, a stark contrast to the chill of the room and the deeper, colder fear that gripped her heart. Could she truly risk opening herself up to him again, after all the pain, all the years of carefully constructed defenses? She drew a shaky breath, the scent of wood smoke and his familiar, earthy scent filling her lungs, triggering a cascade of memories. She remembered a spring day, long ago, when they had ridden out together, escaping the confines of the castle walls. The sun had been warm on their faces, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers, and the world had seemed full of endless possibilities. They had found a secluded clearing, a hidden haven nestled amidst the ancient trees of the Windthorn forest. He had spread his cloak on the ground, and they had sat together, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese, their laughter echoing through the trees. He had braided wildflowers into her hair, his fingers brushing against her skin, sending shivers of delight through her. And he had kissed her a sweet, innocent kiss that had promised a future that would never come to be. The memory, so vivid, so achingly beautiful, brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back, forcing herself to focus on the present, on the man who stood before her, a man who was both familiar and a stranger. "Tristan," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I do not know if I can do this. It has been too long. Too much has happened." He lowered his hand, but his gaze remained locked on hers, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of hope and understanding. "I know it will not be easy, Eleanor. But I believe we can find our way back to each other. If we are willing to try. And what if we fail?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if the pain is too great, the wounds too deep?" He stepped closer, his voice softening. "Then we will have at least tried. We will have faced our past, instead of running from it. Is that not better than living with regrets, with a constant what if haunting our every thought?" His words resonated with her, striking a chord deep within her soul. She had lived with regrets for so long, with the ghost of their lost love casting a shadow over her life. Was it not time to face those ghosts, to finally lay them to rest? She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception, any sign that his intentions were not true. But all she saw was sincerity, a deep longing that mirrored her own. "The orchard," she said suddenly, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. "Do you remember the orchard?" A flicker of a smile touched his lips. "How could I forget? It was our sanctuary." "Meet me there," she said, her voice gaining strength, her decision made. "At dawn." He nodded, his eyes shining with a renewed hope. "At dawn," he repeated. He bowed his head, a gesture of respect, and then turned to leave. At the door, he paused, looking back at her. "Eleanor," he said softly, "thank you for giving us a chance." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts, with the echoes of a lost spring, and with the daunting, exhilarating prospect of facing her past and perhaps finding a future she had long thought impossible. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, a reflection of the uncertainty and hope that now filled her heart. She wrapped her arms more firmly and gazed at the door. Dawn felt like a lifetime away. Chapter 5. The Serpent in the Garden. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of pale pink and gold as Eleanor made her way to the orchard. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a stark contrast to the warmth of her bedchamber, a warmth she had found impossible to embrace, with her thoughts a whirlwind. She had barely slept, tossing and turning, her mind replaying every conversation with Tristan, every memory of their shared past. She wore a simple woolen gown, its deep green color blending with the muted tones of the late autumn landscape. A heavy cloak, lined with fur, protected her from the morning chill. She had left her hair unbound, letting it cascade down her back in a wave of dark curls, a small act of rebellion against the rigid formality of courtly life. The orchard was silent, deserted, the only sound the gentle rustling of the wind through the bare branches of the apple trees. The trees, once laden with fruit, now stood stark and skeletal against the pale sky, a reminder of the passage of time, of the cycles of life and loss. She found the spot they had favored, a small clearing nestled beneath the branches of an ancient, gnarled apple tree. The memories flooded back, almost overwhelming in their intensity. She sat down on the cold ground, pulling her cloak tightly around her, her gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, waiting. She didn't have to wait long. He appeared as if from the mist itself, his figure emerging from the shadows, tall and imposing. He wore a dark tunic and breeches, his only adornment a simple leather belt and the sword that hung at his side, a constant reminder of his warrior's life. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every detail of her appearance. "You came," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I said I would," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He sat down opposite her, mirroring her posture, the distance between them a physical representation of the emotional chasm that still separated them. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of their shared history. "It has changed," he said finally, his gaze sweeping over the orchard. "Just like us." "Everything changes, Tristan," she replied softly. "Nothing remains the same." He nodded, his gaze returning to her. "But some things endure, despite the changes." She knew what he was referring to, the love they had once shared, the bond that had connected them, a bond that had been tested, strained, but perhaps not entirely broken. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me what happened after you were captured." He hesitated, his eyes clouding over with pain. "It is not a pleasant story, Eleanor." "I need to know," she insisted. "I need to understand." He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if reliving the memories in his mind. He began to speak, his voice low and rough, recounting the horrors of his captivity, the years of hardship, the constant struggle for survival. He spoke of the brutal conditions, the lack of food, the ever-present threat of death. He spoke of the despair that had threatened to consume him, the loss of hope, the slow erosion of his spirit. He spoke of the other prisoners, men from all walks of life, united by their shared suffering. He spoke of the friendships forged in the crucible of captivity, of the acts of kindness and courage that had helped him to endure. And he spoke of the day he had finally been released, a day that had been both joyous and bittersweet. "When I returned," he said, his voice filled with a raw, aching sorrow, "I learned of your marriage. I felt as though my world had ended. Again." Eleanor reached out, her hand covering his, a gesture of comfort, of shared pain. "I am so sorry, Tristan," she whispered. I had no idea." He turned his hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. "I know," he said. "I do not blame you, Eleanor. I blame fate. I blame the war. I blame myself." "Yourself?" she questioned, her brow furrowing. "Why yourself?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because I should have been stronger. I should have escaped. I should have found a way to get back to you." "You cannot blame yourself for what happened, Tristan," she said firmly. "You were a prisoner. You did what you had to do to survive." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a self-recrimination that tore at her heart. "But I failed you, Eleanor. I failed to protect you. I failed to keep my promise." "You did not fail me," she said, her voice unwavering. "You were a victim of circumstance, just as I was. We both did what we had to do." He squeezed her hand, his grip tightening. "But I still love you, Eleanor. I have never stopped loving you." The words, spoken with such raw honesty, such profound emotion, sent a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. Joy, fear, hope, doubt all intertwined, creating a turmoil within her heart. She had longed to hear those words for so many years. But now, hearing them, she was terrified. A sudden noise, the snapping of a twig, broke the spell. Tristan instantly released her hand, his body tensing, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice sharp, alert. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man Eleanor recognized instantly. It was Lord Renfrew, a neighboring lord, and a known rival of her late husband, and a thorn in Eleanor's side. He was also known for his ambition and for his covetous gaze, which was now settled on them. A serpent, indeed, in their garden. His smile was cold. "Forgive me for intruding," Renfrew said, his voice dripping with insincerity. But I couldn't help but overhear a most interesting conversation. He looked pointedly at the space between them and the way Tristan had so swiftly moved to a defensive stance. Chapter 6. Shadows of War and Whispers of Peace. Renfrew's smile widened, revealing teeth that reminded Eleanor of a wolf's. His eyes, cold and calculating, flickered between her and Tristan, lingering a moment too long on Tristan's hand, which still rested near the hilt of his sword. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth as silk, yet laced with an undercurrent of menace. "And Sir Tristan. What a pleasant surprise. I did not realize you were acquainted." Eleanor rose to her feet, her movements graceful despite the sudden surge of adrenaline that coursed through her veins. She straightened her shoulders, meeting Renfrew's gaze with a coldness that matched his own. "Lord Renfrew," she replied, her voice devoid of any warmth. "This is a private conversation. I must ask you to leave." Renfrew chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Private? In the middle of the orchard? I think not, my lady. This concerns me, as it concerns all the lords of this region." Tristan also rose, his towering height and imposing presence a stark contrast to Renfrew's slighter build. He stood protectively close to Eleanor, his body a shield between her and the unwelcome intruder. "Lord Renfrew," Tristan said, his voice dangerously low, "you are mistaken. This is a matter between Lady Eleanor and myself. It has nothing to do with you." Renfrew's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Everything that happens in this region concerns me, Sir Tristan, especially when it involves the widow of Blackwood, a woman of considerable influence." Eleanor felt a surge of anger at his words, at the way he spoke of her as if she were a prize to be won, a piece in his political game. She had worked tirelessly to maintain the peace and prosperity of Blackwood since her husband's death, and she would not allow Renfrew to undermine her authority or to threaten her newfound hope. "My affairs are my own, Lord Renfrew," she said, her voice sharp, "and I will not be dictated to by you, or anyone else." Renfrew's eyes narrowed. "You are playing a dangerous game, Lady Eleanor. Aligning yourself with a man who was once a prisoner of war, a man whose loyalty to the king is questionable." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The accusation, so blatant, so public, was a direct threat. Renfrew was playing a dangerous game, one that could have dire consequences for both her and Tristan. Tristan's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, his body radiating a barely suppressed rage. "You dare to question my loyalty?" he growled. "I dare to speak the truth," Renfrew retorted, his voice rising. "You were captured by the enemy, Sir Tristan. You spent years in their captivity. Who knows what secrets you may have revealed, what promises you may have made?" "I revealed nothing," Tristan said, his voice hard as steel. "I made no promises. I remained loyal to my king, even in the face of death." "So you claim," Renfrew sneered. "But can we be sure? Can we trust a man who has consorted with the enemy?" Eleanor knew that Renfrew's accusations were baseless, fueled by his own ambition and his desire to weaken her position. But she also knew that in the current political climate, such accusations could easily be twisted, manipulated, used to destroy them both. The whispers of war had been growing louder in recent months, and the king was increasingly paranoid, suspicious of any potential threat to his authority. "Lord Renfrew," she said, her voice calm despite the turmoil raging within her, "you are overstepping your bounds. I will not tolerate these accusations. Sir Tristan is a guest at Winthorne, and he is under my protection." Renfrew laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Your protection? My dear Lady Eleanor, you are in no position to protect anyone. You are a woman alone, surrounded by enemies. And you have just made a very powerful enemy, indeed." He turned to leave, his parting words hanging heavy in the air. "I will be watching you, Lady Eleanor. Both of you. And I will not hesitate to report this indiscretion to the king." He disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Eleanor and Tristan standing alone in the orchard, the fragile peace of their reunion shattered by Renfrew's venomous words. The shadows of war, both past and present, had suddenly cast a dark cloud over their future, threatening to extinguish the faint glimmer of hope that had begun to flicker between them. The wind felt colder, and the scent of apples now felt tainted. Eleanor shivered, but not from the cold. Chapter 7. A Dance of Duty and Desire. The weight of Renfrew's threat hung heavy in the air, a suffocating presence that threatened to smother the fragile embers of their rekindled connection. Eleanor turned to Tristan, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "He will do it, you know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He will go to the king." Tristan nodded, his face grim. "I know. Renfrew is a snake, slithering through the court, poisoning everything he touches. What will we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The thought of facing the king's wrath, of being accused of treason, filled her with dread. Tristan reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch, so warm, so comforting, sent a shiver of longing through her. "We will face it together, Eleanor, as we should have done years ago." His words, spoken with such conviction, gave her a surge of strength. She had been alone for so long, carrying the burden of her responsibilities, of her past, on her own shoulders. Now, she had Tristan by her side, a partner, a protector, a man who loved her. "But how?" she asked. "Renfrew has the king's ear. He will twist the truth, make us appear guilty of something we are not." Tristan's eyes hardened with determination. "We will tell the truth, Eleanor. We will go to the king ourselves, before Renfrew has a chance to poison his mind." "But the king, he is known for his impulsiveness," she said, her voice laced with fear. "He may not listen to reason." "We have to try," Tristan insisted. "We have no other choice. We cannot allow Renfrew to destroy us." He was right, she knew. They had to fight back, to defend themselves against Renfrew's malicious accusations. But the prospect of facing the king, of putting their fate in his hands, was terrifying. "There is something else," Tristan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something I have not told you." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes widening with apprehension. "What is it?" He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "When I was released from captivity, it was not a simple exchange of prisoners. There were conditions." "Conditions?" she echoed, her heart pounding. "What kind of conditions?" "I was sworn to secrecy," he said, his voice strained. "But I believe I can trust you, Eleanor. I must trust you." He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I was tasked by the king to uncover a conspiracy. A plot against the throne." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "A conspiracy? Here? In this region?" Tristan nodded. "That is what I have been sent to investigate. And I believe Renfrew is involved." The revelation sent a chill down her spine. Renfrew, a traitor? It seemed impossible, and yet it made a terrifying kind of sense. His ambition, his ruthlessness, his constant attempts to undermine her authority, it all pointed to a deeper, darker motive. "This changes everything," she whispered. "If Renfrew is a traitor, then his accusations against us, they are a diversion. A way to distract the king from his own treachery." "Exactly," Tristan agreed. "And that is why we must go to the king. We must expose Renfrew, before he can do any more damage." The task ahead of them seemed even more daunting now, the stakes even higher. They were not just fighting for their own survival, but for the safety of the kingdom itself. They were caught in a web of political intrigue, of betrayal and deceit, and they had to navigate it carefully, or risk being consumed by it. A dance of duty and desire, a delicate balance with consequence. Tristan pulled her closer and held her for the first time since his return. She closed her eyes. "We leave at first light," then Eleanor stated, a decision made. There was no turning back. Chapter 8. The Falcon's Flight. The journey to the king's court was fraught with a tension that was almost palpable. Eleanor and Tristan rode side by side, accompanied by a small, loyal contingent of Winthorn guards, their every movement shadowed by the threat of Renfrew's treachery. The landscape, once familiar and comforting, now seemed menacing, every rustle of leaves, every shadow a potential threat. They spoke little, their conversations hushed and urgent, focused on the task ahead. They had to present a united front to convince the king of their innocence, of Renfrew's guilt. But the uncertainty of their reception, the knowledge that the king's favor could be fickle, weighed heavily on them. Eleanor found herself constantly stealing glances at Tristan, studying his profile, searching for any sign of doubt, of fear. But his face was resolute, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his demeanor that of a warrior prepared for battle. He had changed, she realized, not just physically but emotionally as well. The carefree young man she had once known had been replaced by a hardened, battle-scarred warrior, a man who had faced death and survived. And yet, beneath that hardened exterior, she could still see glimpses of the man she had loved, the man who had promised her a future that had been stolen from them. They stopped for the night at a small, secluded monastery, nestled in the foothills of the mountains that marked the border of the king's lands. The monks, sworn to a life of poverty and prayer, offered them simple food and shelter, their quiet hospitality a welcome respite from the tension of their journey. Eleanor found herself drawn to the small chapel, its candlelit interior offering a sense of peace, of sanctuary. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, seeking solace, seeking guidance. She prayed for strength, for courage, for the wisdom to navigate the treacherous path that lay ahead. She prayed for Tristan, for his safety, for his success in uncovering the conspiracy that threatened the kingdom. And she prayed for herself, for the strength to face her fears, to overcome the doubts that still plagued her. She felt a presence behind her, and turned to see Tristan standing in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the flickering candlelight. He walked towards her, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. He knelt beside her, his hand reaching out to take hers. His touch, so warm, so familiar, sent a wave of comfort through her. "Are you afraid, Eleanor?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she admitted. "But I am also determined. I will not let Renfrew win. I will not let him destroy us." He squeezed her hand, his grip tightening. "We will face this together, Eleanor. I promise you." His words, spoken with such conviction, gave her a renewed sense of hope. She looked into his eyes and saw not just determination, but love, a love that had endured despite the years of separation, the pain, the betrayal. "I love you, Tristan," she whispered, the words a confession, a vow, a testament to the enduring power of their connection. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of reassurance, of hope, of a promise of a future that might still be theirs. "And I love you, Eleanor," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. More than words can say. They remained there, kneeling together in the candlelit chapel, their hands clasped, their hearts united, drawing strength from each other, preparing for the battle that lay ahead. The falcon, the symbol of his house, was poised for flight, ready to soar above the treachery and deceit, ready to fight for truth, for justice, for love. The quiet of the monastery offered a brief comfort that both knew wouldn't last. They stood together. Chapter 9. Scars of the Heart and Sword. The king's court was a swirling vortex of opulent displays, hushed whispers, and veiled threats. Eleanor, accustomed to the relative quiet of Winthorn and Blackwood, felt a wave of unease wash over her as she entered the grand hall. The sheer scale of the castle, the sheer number of courtiers, each vying for the king's attention, was overwhelming. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, incense, and something darker, more sinister. The scent of fear. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, embroidered with silver thread, a subtle nod to Tristan's house colors. Her hair was styled in an elaborate braid, adorned with pearls, a symbol of her status and wealth. She had to project an image of strength, of confidence, even though her heart was pounding with apprehension. Tristan, by her side, was a picture of stoic calm. He wore a tunic of dark gray, his only adornment the silver falcon pendant that hung around his neck. His sword, sheathed at his side, was a constant reminder of his warrior's identity, of the danger that lurked beneath the surface of courtly life. They were ushered into the king's presence, their arrival announced by a herald's trumpet blast. King Oberon, a man known for his volatile temper and his unpredictable nature, sat upon his throne, his gaze sweeping over them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He was a large man, his once powerful physique now showing the signs of age and indulgence. His eyes, however, were sharp and piercing, missing nothing. "Lady Eleanor of Blackwood," the king said, his voice booming through the hall, "and Sir Tristan de Warwick, you have requested an audience.
Speak."
Eleanor stepped forward, her voice clear and steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "Your Majesty, we have come to you with grave news. We have reason to believe that there is a conspiracy afoot, a plot against your throne." The king's eyes narrowed. "A conspiracy? You dare to accuse someone in my court of treason?" "We do, Your Majesty," Tristan said, stepping forward to stand beside Eleanor. "And we believe that Lord Renfrew is involved." A murmur rippled through the court, the courtiers exchanging shocked glances. Renfrew, a man of considerable influence, a trusted advisor to the king, it seemed impossible. "Renfrew?" The king scoffed. "You accuse my loyal servant of treachery? You have proof of this, I presume?" "We have reason to believe, Your Majesty," Tristan said, his voice calm and measured, "that Lord Renfrew has been communicating with our enemies, providing them with information, plotting to overthrow your rule." He recounted the events in the orchard, the overheard conversation, Renfrew's veiled threats, his accusations of treason against them, a clear attempt to deflect suspicion from himself. The king listened, his expression unreadable. He stroked his beard, his gaze shifting between Eleanor and Tristan, weighing their words, assessing their credibility. "And what is your personal involvement in this, Sir Tristan?" the king asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "You were, after all, a prisoner of war, a man who spent years in enemy captivity." Eleanor felt a surge of anger at the king's words, at the way he was questioning Tristan's loyalty. She knew the pain he had endured, the sacrifices he had made. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice firm, "Sir Tristan is a man of honor. He remained loyal to you, even in the face of torture and death. He would never betray his king." "So you say, Lady Eleanor," the king replied, his gaze shifting to her. "But you are, shall we say, close to Sir Tristan. Your judgment may be clouded." Eleanor blushed, but she held her ground. "My loyalty is to you, Your Majesty, and I believe that Sir Tristan is telling the truth." The king remained silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the assembled courtiers. Then he spoke, his voice sharp and decisive. "Lord Renfrew," he called out. "Step forward." Renfrew, who had been standing near the back of the hall, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room, stepped forward, bowing low before the king. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice trembling slightly, I do not know what these accusations are about. I am your loyal servant. I would never betray you." "You deny these charges, then?" the king asked, his voice like thunder. "I do, Your Majesty," Renfrew insisted. "These are lies, spread by those who seek to undermine my position, to sow discord in your court." The king turned to Tristan. "You have proof, Sir Tristan? Something more than mere accusations?" Tristan nodded. "I do, Your Majesty. I have been gathering evidence. I have intercepted messages, spoken to informants. I can prove Renfrew's treachery." He gestured to the scars on his arms. "These are not all from battle, Your Grace. Some are from persuasion. For information I refuse to give." The king's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on Renfrew. The tension in the hall was palpable, the fate of 3 people hanging in the balance. The scars on Tristan's arms, a testament to his loyalty, were laid bare for all to see. Chapter 10. Beneath a sky of ash and stars. The king's gaze remained fixed on Renfrew, his expression unreadable, a storm brewing beneath the surface of his regal composure. The silence in the hall was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the torches and the faint whispers of the assembled courtiers. Eleanor held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, her fate, and Tristan's, hanging precariously in the balance. "Renfrew," the king said finally, his voice low and dangerous, "you have served me for many years. I have trusted you, rewarded you, and now you are accused of betraying that trust, of plotting against my throne." Renfrew fell to his knees, his face ashen, his voice a desperate plea. "Your Majesty, I swear to you, I am innocent. These are lies, fabricated by my enemies, by those who are jealous of my position." "Lies?" the king roared, his voice echoing through the hall. "You dare to call the word of Sir Tristan, a knight who has proven his loyalty time and again, a lie? He is a former prisoner, Your Majesty," Renfrew stammered. "His mind may be affected by his captivity. He may be manipulated by others." "And what of Lady Eleanor?" the king challenged, his gaze shifting to her. "Is she also manipulated? Is she also a liar?" Renfrew hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between Eleanor and the king. He knew that accusing Eleanor directly would be a dangerous move. She was a powerful woman in her own right, with allies in the court. I do not know, Your Majesty," he mumbled. "I only know that I am innocent." "Innocent?" the king repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Then how do you explain the evidence that Sir Tristan has presented? The intercepted messages? The informants?" Renfrew was silent, his head bowed, his body trembling. He had no answer, no defense against the mounting evidence of his treachery. Tristan stepped forward, his voice calm and resolute. "Your Majesty, I have in my possession a letter, written by Lord Renfrew to our enemies, outlining his plans to betray you, to help them invade your kingdom." He produced a sealed scroll, bearing Renfrew's crest, and handed it to the king. The king broke the seal, his eyes scanning the contents of the letter. As he read, his face grew darker, his expression turning to one of cold fury. This is treason," he thundered, his voice shaking with rage. "You would betray your king, your kingdom, for your own selfish gain?" Renfrew remained silent, his head bowed, his body slumped in defeat. He knew he was caught, his treachery exposed. The king rose from his throne, his eyes blazing with anger. "Guards," he roared. "Seize this traitor." The guards, who had been standing silently at attention, moved swiftly, surrounding Renfrew, their swords drawn. They dragged him to his feet, his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. "You will be tried for treason, Lord Renfrew," the king said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "And if found guilty, as I have no doubt you will be, you will face the consequences." Renfrew was led away, his cries of protest echoing through the hall. The courtiers watched in stunned silence, the reality of Renfrew's betrayal sinking in. The king turned his attention back to Eleanor and Tristan, his expression softening slightly. "Sir Tristan," he said, "you have done a great service to your king and your kingdom. You have exposed a traitor, prevented a war. You will be rewarded." Tristan bowed his head. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I only did my duty." "And you, Lady Eleanor," the king continued, his gaze fixed on her. "You have shown great courage and loyalty. You stood by Sir Tristan, even when it was dangerous to do so. You have my gratitude." Eleanor curtsied. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I only did what I believed was right." The king nodded, his gaze lingering on them for a moment longer. Then, he dismissed them, signaling that the audience was over. As they left the hall, Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had survived. They had exposed Renfrew's treachery, cleared their names, and earned the king's gratitude. But the ordeal had taken its toll. She felt drained, exhausted, both physically and emotionally. They returned to their chambers, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. The sky outside was dark, filled with a mixture of ash from the city's fires and the faint glimmer of stars. Tristan reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "We did it, Eleanor," he said softly. "We are safe." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the warmth of his hand, the reassurance of his presence. "Yes," she whispered, "but at what cost?" She thought of Renfrew, a man condemned. She looked into Tristan's eyes, and the cost was higher than even they had planned. The stars offered no comfort. Chapter 11. The Lion and the Lamb. The aftermath of Renfrew's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. The court buzzed with rumors and speculation as the details of his treachery were revealed. Eleanor and Tristan found themselves at the center of attention, praised for their courage and loyalty, their actions lauded as having saved the kingdom from a devastating war. But amidst the celebrations, Eleanor felt a lingering unease, a sense of disquiet that she couldn't quite shake. Renfrew's betrayal had shaken her faith in the people around her, in the stability of the world she had always known. She had seen firsthand how easily trust could be broken, how quickly power could corrupt. Tristan, too, seemed affected by the events. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his usual stoicism tinged with a hint of melancholy. She knew he was carrying the weight of his responsibilities, of the secrets he had kept, of the lives that had been affected by his actions. They were granted chambers in the royal palace, a sign of the king's favor. But the opulent surroundings did little to ease Eleanor's discomfort. She longed for the familiarity of Winthorne, for the quiet solitude of her own home. One evening, as they sat together in their chambers, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire, Eleanor decided to voice her concerns. "Tristan," she said softly, "are you all right?" He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of sadness in their depths. "I am weary, Eleanor. Weary of the court, of the intrigue, of the constant threat of betrayal." She reached out, her hand covering his, her touch a silent offering of comfort and support. "I understand," she said. "It is a lot to bear." He squeezed her hand, his grip tightening. "I never wanted this, Eleanor. I never wanted to be a part of this world. I only wanted to be with you." His words, spoken with such raw honesty, touched her deeply. She knew the sacrifices he had made, the life he had given up, for duty, for honor. "And I with you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "But we are here now, and we must make the best of it." He nodded, his gaze searching hers. "But what is the best, Eleanor? What do we want? What do we really want?" It was a question that had been haunting her, too. They had been so focused on surviving, on overcoming the obstacles in their path, that they had not had time to consider their own desires, their own future. I do not know," she admitted. "I want peace. I want to be free from fear. I want to be happy. And can you find that here?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "In this court, surrounded by vipers and schemers?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window, to the city lights twinkling below. She had always believed that her duty lay in serving her people, in maintaining the stability of her lands. But now, she wondered if there was more to life than duty, than responsibility. "I do not know," she repeated, "but I know that I cannot find it alone. I need you, Tristan. I need your strength, your wisdom, your love." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of reassurance, of hope, of a promise of a future that might still be theirs, if they were brave enough to seize it. "And you have me, Eleanor," he whispered. "Always." But even as he spoke the words, a shadow crossed his face, a flicker of doubt that belied his confident tone. She knew that he was still wrestling with his own demons, with the scars of his past, with the burden of his responsibilities. A knock on the door interrupted their moment of intimacy. A royal messenger stood there, bearing a sealed scroll, the king's crest emblazoned upon it. "For Sir Tristan de Warwick," the messenger announced, his voice formal. Tristan took the scroll, his expression wary. He broke the seal, his eyes scanning the contents of the message. As he read, his face paled, his hand trembling slightly. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice filled with apprehension. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a mixture of fear and resignation in their depths. "The king," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He commands me to lead an army. To the north. There is another threat. A new war brewing." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The peace they had so desperately sought, the future they had dared to dream of, seemed to slip away once more, swallowed by the ever-present threat of conflict. The lion, it seemed, was not yet ready to lie down with the lamb. And she was not a lamb. She looked at Tristan, her warrior, her love. And he was not hers. Not truly. Not yet. Chapter 12. A Cloak of Secrets and Lies. The news of the impending war cast a pall over the court, replacing the celebratory atmosphere with a sense of grim anticipation. Preparations for battle began immediately, the palace transforming into a hive of activity, with soldiers, messengers, and supply wagons crowding the courtyards. Eleanor watched the unfolding events with a growing sense of dread. She had hoped, prayed, that the exposure of Renfrew's treachery would bring an end to the conflict, that peace would finally prevail. But it seemed that fate had other plans. Tristan was consumed by his duties, spending his days meeting with commanders, reviewing maps, overseeing the mobilization of troops. He was distant, preoccupied, his thoughts focused on the daunting task ahead. She knew he was doing what he had to do, fulfilling his duty to the king, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, of separation. She tried to be supportive, to offer him comfort and encouragement, but she felt increasingly isolated, shut out from his world of military strategy and political maneuvering. She longed for the intimacy they had shared, for the moments of quiet connection that had sustained them through the darkest of times. One evening, as she sat alone in their chambers, feeling restless and uneasy, she decided to seek solace in the palace library. She had always found comfort in books, in the wisdom and escape they offered. The library was a vast, dimly lit room, filled with towering shelves of ancient scrolls and leather-bound tomes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a comforting aroma that evoked a sense of timelessness, of continuity. She wandered through the stacks, her fingers trailing along the spines of the books, searching for something, anything, to distract her from her worries. She came across a section on history and pulled out a volume detailing the previous wars that had ravaged the kingdom. As she read, she stumbled upon a passage that caught her attention. It described a secret treaty, signed generations ago, between her own family, the rulers of Winthorn, and a neighboring kingdom, a kingdom that was now rumored to be involved in the brewing conflict. The treaty, according to the text, involved a marriage alliance, a promise of mutual support in times of war. But the marriage had never taken place. The intended bride, Eleanor's great-aunt, had died before the wedding, and the treaty had been forgotten. Or so everyone believed. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the implications of this discovery. If the treaty was still valid, then she, as the current lady of Winthorn, could be bound by its terms. She could be forced to marry someone from the enemy kingdom, a move that could potentially avert the war, but at a terrible cost. She closed the book, her mind reeling. She had to tell Tristan she knew, but she hesitated. He was already burdened with so much responsibility, with the weight of the impending war on his shoulders. Could she add this to his burdens? And yet, she couldn't keep it to herself. It was too important, too potentially dangerous. She had to tell him, and she had to do it now. She found him in the war room, surrounded by maps and military advisors. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with exhaustion, his eyes filled with a weary concern. "Eleanor," he said, his voice strained. "What is it? Is something wrong?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. I found something," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the library. Something about a treaty. A secret treaty." He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "A treaty? What kind of treaty?" She explained what she had discovered, the ancient alliance between Winthorn and the neighboring kingdom, the unfulfilled marriage contract. As she spoke, Tristan's expression changed, his eyes widening with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Are you sure about this, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice incredulous. "I read it myself," she insisted. "In the history books. It's real, Tristan." He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. This changes everything," he said, his voice low and troubled. If this treaty is still valid, it could mean I have to marry someone from the enemy kingdom, she finished for him, her voice filled with dread. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. No, he said, his voice firm. I will not let that happen. I will not lose you again, Eleanor. Not like this. He pulled her into a fierce hug. There has to be another way, Eleanor spoke into his chest. He held her tighter and whispered a reply. There will be. Chapter 13. The Price of Loyalty. Tristan's refusal to even consider the possibility of Eleanor fulfilling the ancient treaty was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it reaffirmed his love for her, his unwavering commitment to their relationship. Terrifying because it meant defying the king, risking his wrath, potentially jeopardizing the entire kingdom. They spent the rest of the night poring over the ancient texts, searching for a loophole, a way out of the predicament. But the language of the treaty was clear, unambiguous. It was a binding agreement, a sacred oath between two families, and Eleanor, as the head of her house, was bound by its terms. As dawn approached, they were no closer to a solution. Exhaustion and despair began to creep in, threatening to overwhelm them. There has to be something we're missing, Tristan said, his voice hoarse, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Some detail, some clause, that can release you from this obligation. Eleanor shook her head, her heart heavy with despair. I don't see it, Tristan. The treaty is its ironclad. Then we break it, he said, his voice firm, his eyes flashing with defiance. We defy the king. We defy the treaty. We defy anyone who tries to come between us. Eleanor looked at him, her heart filled with a mixture of love and fear. She admired his courage, his unwavering loyalty, but she knew the risks were enormous. Tristan, she said softly, we cannot simply defy the king. It would be treason. It could start a war. And letting you marry someone from the enemy kingdom that wouldn't start a war? He challenged, his voice rising. That would be handing them victory on a silver platter. It would be betraying everything we've fought for. But there might be another way, she pleaded. We could negotiate, offer them something else, something in exchange for releasing me from the treaty. He scoffed. Negotiate? With those wolves? They don't want negotiation, Eleanor. They want power. They want control. And they see this treaty as their way to get it. He was right, she knew. The neighboring kingdom had always been ambitious, eager to expand its territory, to increase its influence. This treaty was a golden opportunity for them, a chance to gain a foothold in the heart of the king's lands. Then what do we do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her hope dwindling with each passing moment. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind racing. We fight, he said finally, his voice resolute. We fight for our freedom. We fight for our love. We fight for the future we deserve. His words, spoken with such passion, such conviction, stirred something deep within her. She, too, was tired of being a pawn in other people's games, of having her fate dictated by ancient treaties and political machinations. She wanted to choose her own destiny, to be with the man she loved, to live a life of peace and happiness. But how? She asked. How can we fight against the king, against an entire kingdom? He stopped pacing, turning to face her, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. We have allies, Eleanor. We have friends in the court, people who are loyal to us, who believe in justice and honor. We can rally them to our cause. And what of the army? She asked. You are supposed to lead them north, to fight the enemy. How can you lead an army against the king? He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. I don't know, he admitted. But I will find a way. I will not abandon you, Eleanor. I will not let them take you from me. His words, spoken with such raw emotion, brought tears to her eyes. She reached out, her hand cupping his cheek, her touch a silent vow of love and loyalty. And I will not abandon you, Tristan, she whispered. Whatever happens, we will face it together. They embraced, their bodies clinging to each other, drawing strength from their shared love, their shared determination. They knew the road ahead would be perilous, filled with danger and uncertainty. But they were ready to fight, to risk everything for their freedom, for their love, for the future they so desperately craved. The price of loyalty, they knew, could be steep, but it was a price they were willing to pay. First, they would need a plan. Chapter 14. The Tears of a Queen. The days that followed were a blur of secret meetings, whispered conversations, and clandestine preparations. Tristan, using his position as commander of the king's army, began to subtly gather support for their cause, reaching out to trusted allies, to lords and knights who were disillusioned with the king's increasingly erratic rule, who believed in justice and honor. Eleanor, too, played her part, using her influence as Lady of Blackwood to sway public opinion, to plant seeds of doubt about the wisdom of the impending war, of the king's reliance on outdated treaties. It was a dangerous game, a delicate dance of deception and intrigue. They had to be careful, cautious, always aware of the possibility of betrayal, of discovery. One wrong move, one misplaced word, could lead to their downfall. They found an unexpected ally in Queen Isolde, the king's wife. A woman of quiet strength and keen intellect, she had long been aware of her husband's flaws, of his growing paranoia and his susceptibility to flattery and manipulation. She had witnessed Renfrew's treachery, and she suspected that there were others like him in the court, whispering poison in the king's ear. Eleanor had met with the queen in secret, confiding in her about the ancient treaty, about Tristan's refusal to let her be sacrificed for political gain. The queen had listened, her expression grave, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "I understand your plight, Lady Eleanor," she had said, her voice soft but firm. "And I admire your courage, your loyalty to Sir Tristan. He is a good man, a true knight. He does not deserve to be caught in this web of deceit. But what can we do, your majesty?" Eleanor had asked, her voice filled with desperation. "The king is determined to enforce the treaty. He sees it as a way to avert the war." "The king is misguided," the queen had replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "He believes he is acting in the best interests of the kingdom, but he is blinded by fear, by the whispers of those who seek to control him. Can you not influence him?" Eleanor had pleaded. "Can you not make him see reason?" The queen had shaken her head. "I have tried, Lady Eleanor. Believe me, I have tried. But he does not listen to me anymore. He sees me as weak, sentimental. He trusts only those who flatter him, who tell him what he wants to hear." "Then what hope is there?" Eleanor had asked, her voice barely a whisper, her despair growing with each passing moment. The queen had reached out, her hand covering Eleanor's, her touch surprisingly warm and comforting. "There is always hope, Lady Eleanor. We must not give up. We must fight for what is right, for what we believe in." "But how?" Eleanor had asked. "How can we fight against the king, against his army?" The queen had hesitated, her gaze searching Eleanor's. "There are those in the court," she had said finally, her voice low and cautious, "who are not happy with the king's rule, who believe that he has become unstable, who fear for the future of the kingdom." "You mean they would support us?" Eleanor had asked, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "Perhaps," the queen had replied. "But we must be careful. We must be discreet. We cannot risk exposing ourselves until we are sure of their loyalty." The queen had promised to help, to use her influence to gather support for their cause, to find a way to resolve the situation without resorting to war, to bloodshed. Leaving the queen's chambers, a scene played out in the hallway. Eleanor found herself face to face with the royal advisor, Lord Elmsworth. His face was pale. "I overheard everything," he spoke low. Eleanor was frozen, stunned. This could ruin everything. Elmsworth continued. "The queen, she weeps for this kingdom. She weeps for you." He bowed and walked away, leaving Eleanor with more questions than answers. The queen's tears, it seemed, were not just tears of sadness, but tears of defiance. And they would not be shed in vain. Chapter 15. Where Honor Lies Bleeding. Lord Elmsworth's unexpected declaration of support, though cryptic, gave Eleanor and Tristan a much-needed boost of hope. It suggested that the queen's influence extended further than they had initially realized, and that there were others within the court who shared their concerns about the king's judgment and the impending war. However, The situation remained precarious. Tristan's departure for the north was fast approaching, and with it, the deadline for Eleanor's forced marriage should the treaty be enforced. They needed to act swiftly, decisively, before it was too late. Tristan, torn between his duty to the king and his love for Eleanor, struggled to devise a plan that would satisfy both obligations. He couldn't simply abandon his post, desert his army. It would be an act of treason, a betrayal of the men who trusted him, who looked to him for leadership. One evening, as they sat together in their chambers, the weight of their predicament pressing down on them, Tristan finally spoke, his voice filled with a grim determination. "I have a plan, Eleanor," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But it is dangerous. And it may not work." Eleanor reached out, her hand covering his, her touch a silent offering of support and trust. "Tell me," she said softly. He took a deep breath, his gaze searching hers. "I will go north," he said. "I will lead the army, as the king commands. But I will not engage the enemy. I will stall, delay, buy us time." "But how?" she asked. "The king will expect results. He will demand action. I will send him reports," he replied. "Exaggerated reports of enemy movements, of skirmishes, of minor victories. I will make it appear as though we are engaged in a difficult campaign, that we are slowly gaining ground." "But that's deception, Tristan," she said, her voice filled with concern. "It's lying to the king." "It is," he agreed. "But it is a necessary lie. A lie to protect you, to protect us, to prevent a needless war." "And what then?" she asked. "What is the ultimate goal?" "The ultimate goal," he said, his voice firm, "is to expose the truth. To reveal the king's instability, his reliance on outdated treaties, his willingness to sacrifice his own people for political gain. To show the court, the kingdom, that he is no longer fit to rule." "And how do we do that?" she asked, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. "We use the Queen's support," he replied. "We use Elmsworth's influence. We rally the lords and knights who are loyal to us, who believe in justice and honor. We present our case to the council, to the people. We demand a change." It's a rebellion, Tristan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's treason. It is a necessary evil, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "To save the kingdom, we must be willing to risk everything. Even our lives." His words, spoken with such passion, such determination, sent a shiver down her spine. She knew he was right. They had no other choice. They had to fight, to risk everything for their freedom, for their love, for the future of the kingdom. But as they embraced, preparing for the challenges ahead, a sudden commotion outside their chambers interrupted their moment of resolve. The sound of shouting, of clashing steel, echoed through the corridors. Tristan grabbed his sword, his body tensing, his eyes alert. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice sharp. He moved to the door, his hand on the hilt of his sword, ready to defend them against whatever threat lay outside. He opened the door cautiously, peering out into the corridor. What he saw made his blood run cold. A group of royal guards, their swords drawn, were engaged in a fierce battle with a smaller group of men Tristan recognized as his own loyal soldiers. "What is the meaning of this?" Tristan demanded, his voice thundering through the corridor. The captain of the royal guards, a man named Sir Kellen, a known sycophant of the king, turned to face him, his face contorted with rage. "You are under arrest, Sir Tristan," he snarled. "For treason against the king." Tristan's heart sank. Their plan had been discovered. Someone had betrayed them. Honor, it seemed, lay bleeding in the corridors of power. The fight had begun. Chapter 16. A tapestry of truth and deception. Tristan stood his ground, his sword held ready, his eyes narrowed in defiance. "Treason?" he echoed, his voice laced with controlled fury. "On what grounds?" Sir Kellen sneered, his grip tightening on his own bloodied blade. "You conspire against the king, Sir Tristan. You plot to overthrow him, to seize the throne for yourself." "Those are lies," Tristan retorted, his gaze unwavering. "I am loyal to the king." I have always served him faithfully. Your actions speak louder than your words, Kellen countered. You have been gathering support, rallying those who are disloyal to the king. You have been delaying the campaign in the north, buying time for your treacherous schemes. Tristan knew that Kellen's accusations were based on half-truths, on twisted interpretations of his actions. He had been gathering support, but not to overthrow the king, but to expose his flaws, to protect Eleanor, to prevent a needless war. He had been delaying the campaign, but not for personal gain, but to buy time, to find a way to resolve the situation peacefully. I have been acting in the best interests of the kingdom, Tristan said, his voice firm. I have been trying to prevent a war, to protect my people. Your people? Kellen scoffed. You mean Lady Eleanor, don't you? You would sacrifice the kingdom for your own selfish desires, for your lust for that woman. Eleanor, who had been standing behind Tristan, her hand on his arm, gasped at Kellen's words. She stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger.
How dare you speak to him like that?
She demanded, her voice trembling with outrage. Sir Tristan is a man of honor. He would never betray his king, his kingdom. Kellen turned his attention to Eleanor, his gaze filled with contempt. And you, my lady, are the cause of all this. Your beauty, your influence has bewitched him, turned him against his rightful ruler. That is enough, Kellen, Tristan said, his voice dangerously low. You will not speak to Lady Eleanor that way. Or what? Kellen challenged, his sword raised. Will you kill me, traitor? Will you add another crime to your list of offenses? Tristan hesitated, his mind racing. He could kill Kellen, silence him, but it would only confirm the accusations against him. It would be seen as an admission of guilt. I will not fight you, Kellen, Tristan said finally, his voice calm but firm. I will not spill the blood of my countrymen. I will surrender myself to the king's justice. A wise decision, Sir Tristan, Kellen said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Though I doubt it will save you from the executioner's axe. Tristan lowered his sword, his gesture of surrender a signal to his own men to stand down. They reluctantly obeyed, their faces filled with a mixture of anger and despair. The royal guards moved forward, disarming Tristan and his men, binding their hands. Eleanor watched in horror, her heart breaking as she saw the man she loved, a man of honor and courage, treated like a common criminal. As they led Tristan away, he turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. I am sorry, Eleanor, he whispered. I failed you. No, Tristan, she cried out, her voice choked with emotion. You did not fail me. You are the bravest, most honorable man I know. But her words were lost in the din of the corridor, as Tristan was dragged away, his fate uncertain. Eleanor stood there alone, her world shattered, her heart broken. The tapestry of truth and deception, woven so carefully over the past weeks, had been ripped apart, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She did not know who had betrayed them, who had revealed their plans to the king. But she knew one thing, the fight was not over. She would not give up. She would find a way to save Tristan, to clear his name, to expose the true traitors. She had lost a battle, but not the war. Chapter 17. The storm breaks. Eleanor was not allowed to see Tristan. She was confined to her chambers, guarded day and night, effectively a prisoner in the palace. The king, enraged by what he perceived as Tristan's treachery, refused to listen to her pleas, to her explanations. He was convinced of Tristan's guilt, fueled by the whispers of his advisors, by the evidence presented by Sir Kellen. Days turned into nights, and the uncertainty of Tristan's fate gnawed at Eleanor's soul. She had no news of him, no idea what was happening, whether he was being tortured, whether he was still alive. The silence was deafening, the waiting unbearable. She tried to maintain a semblance of composure, to project an image of strength, but inside, she was crumbling. The fear for Tristan's life, the despair at their separation, threatened to overwhelm her. She found solace in the small chapel, the same chapel where she and Tristan had shared a moment of peace, of hope, before their world had been torn apart. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped in prayer, seeking guidance, seeking strength. One evening, as she sat in the chapel, lost in her thoughts, she heard a soft voice behind her. Lady Eleanor. She turned to see Queen Isolde standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with concern. Your Majesty, Eleanor said, rising to her feet, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The Queen entered the chapel, closing the door softly behind her. She walked towards Eleanor, her movements slow and deliberate. I have news, she said, her voice barely a whisper. About Sir Tristan. Eleanor held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. What is it? Is he alive? The Queen nodded. He is alive. But he is to be tried for treason. Tomorrow. Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a surge of renewed fear. A trial, it meant there was still a chance, a slim chance, to save him. But it also meant facing the king's wrath, facing the full force of the court's judgment. What can I do? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. How can I help him? The Queen reached out, her hand covering Eleanor's, her touch surprisingly warm and comforting. You must be strong, Lady Eleanor. You must be his voice, his advocate. You must speak the truth, expose the lies. But the king, he will not listen to me, Eleanor said, her voice filled with despair. He believes Tristan is guilty. He may not listen to you, the Queen agreed. But he may listen to others. To those who have influence, who have his respect. Who? Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper.
Who can we turn to?
The Queen hesitated, her gaze searching Eleanor's. There is one, she said finally, her voice low and cautious. Lord Elmsworth. He has doubts about Sir Tristan's guilt. He believes there is more to this than meets the eye. But he overheard us, Eleanor said, her mind racing. He knows our plans. He could betray us. He could, the Queen agreed. But I do not believe he will. He is a man of honor, of integrity. He cares for the kingdom, for its future. And he knows that Sir Tristan is not a traitor. But how can we be sure? Eleanor asked, her voice filled with doubt. We cannot be sure, the Queen admitted. But we have no other choice. We must trust him. He is our only hope. The Queen explained her plan, a daring, desperate gamble to expose the truth, to save Tristan from the executioner's axe. It involved revealing the ancient treaty, exposing the king's flawed judgment, rallying support from the lords and knights who were disillusioned with his rule. It was a risky plan, a dangerous game, but Eleanor knew it was their only chance. She had to be brave. She had to be strong, for Tristan, for herself, for the future of the kingdom. As the Queen left, promising to set the plan in motion, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of determination, of purpose. The storm had broken, the battle had begun, and she was ready to fight. She bowed her head. Dawn would bring more than just light. Chapter 18. Beyond the Walls of Winthorn. The trial of Sir Tristan de Warwick was held in the Great Hall, the same hall where he had first arrived at Winthorn, a ghost from Eleanor's past. Now, he stood before the king, not as a guest, but as an accused traitor, his fate hanging precariously in the balance. The hall was packed, every lord and lady of the court in attendance, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and anticipation. The air was thick with tension, with the weight of unspoken accusations, of hidden agendas. Eleanor, dressed in a simple gown of dark gray, a symbol of mourning, of defiance, sat in the gallery, her gaze fixed on Tristan. He looked pale, gaunt, but his eyes still held that spark of defiance, of unwavering courage that had always drawn her to him. The king, seated upon his throne, his face a mask of cold fury, presided over the proceedings. Sir Kellen, acting as prosecutor, presented the case against Tristan, recounting the evidence, the accusations, the twisted interpretations of his actions. He spoke of Tristan's treasonous meetings, of his conspiracy to overthrow the king, of his delay in engaging the enemy in the north. He painted a picture of a man driven by ambition, by lust, by a desire for power. Tristan, standing before the court, his hands bound, listened to the accusations, his expression stoic, his gaze unwavering. He refused to speak, to defend himself, knowing that his words would be twisted, used against him. As Kellen finished his presentation, the king turned to Tristan, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Sir Tristan," he said, "you have heard the charges against you. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Tristan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the king, his silence a powerful act of defiance. "So, you admit your guilt?" the king challenged, his voice rising. Tristan still did not speak, his silence infuriating the king even further. "Very well," the king said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Since you refuse to defend yourself, I find you guilty of treason. And the sentence is death." A gasp rippled through the hall, the courtiers exchanging shocked glances. Eleanor felt a cry tear from her throat, but she stifled it, forcing herself to remain calm, to remember the queen's plan. Before the king could order the guards to take Tristan away, Lord Elmsworth rose to his feet, his voice booming through the hall. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "I object. This trial is a farce. Sir Tristan has not been given a fair hearing. The evidence against him is circumstantial, based on lies and misinterpretations." The king turned to Elmsworth, his eyes narrowed in anger. "You dare to question my judgment, Elmsworth?" "I dare to speak the truth, Your Majesty," Elmsworth replied, his gaze unwavering. "Sir Tristan is a man of honor, a loyal servant of the kingdom. He would never betray you." He then recounted what he had overheard in the hallway, the queen's tears, the ancient treaty, the king's flawed judgment. He spoke of Tristan's true motives, of his desire to protect Eleanor, to prevent a needless war. As Elmsworth spoke, a murmur spread through the hall, the courtiers exchanging uneasy glances. Some, those who were loyal to the king, remained silent, their faces impassive. But others, those who had doubts about the king's rule, those who believed in justice and honor, began to nod in agreement. The queen, who had been sitting silently beside the king, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope, rose to her feet. "My husband," she said, her voice clear and strong, "Lord Elmsworth speaks the truth. I beg you, reconsider your judgment. Sir Tristan is not a traitor. He is a victim of circumstance, of a misunderstanding." The king hesitated, his gaze shifting between Elmsworth, the queen, and the assembled courtiers. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the growing dissent. He realized that he was losing control, that his authority was being challenged. He looked to Kellen, who, for the first time, looked uncertain. Then at Eleanor. And for the first time he saw her. Not as a pawn, but as a person. "Very well," he said finally, his voice grudging. "I will postpone the execution. I will allow Sir Tristan to present his defense. But he will remain in custody." It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Tristan was still alive, and he had a chance, however slim, to clear his name. The walls of Winthorne, of the king's court, were no longer the defining boundaries of their struggle. It had spread, like wildfire, beyond those walls, to the heart of the kingdom itself. Chapter 19. The Dawn of Reckoning. The reprieve granted by the king, though temporary, gave Eleanor and Tristan a much-needed opportunity to gather evidence, to rally support, to prepare for the final confrontation. They worked tirelessly, communicating through secret messages, smuggled in and out of Tristan's prison cell by loyal servants, by the queen herself. Eleanor, using her influence and the queen's quiet backing, reached out to the lords and knights who had expressed doubts about the king's judgment, who believed in Tristan's innocence. She presented them with the evidence of the ancient treaty, of the king's flawed decision-making, of the conspiracy that had sought to manipulate him. Many were swayed by her arguments, by the evidence she presented. They had seen the king's growing instability, his paranoia, his reliance on sycophants like Kellen. They feared for the future of the kingdom, for their own safety. Tristan, from his prison cell, wrote letters to his former comrades in arms, to the men he had led in battle, appealing to their sense of honor, of loyalty, urging them to stand up for what was right. The support they gathered was growing, but it was still fragile, uncertain. The king still held the power, the authority, and he would not relinquish it easily. The day of Tristan's defense arrived, and the great hall was once again packed, the atmosphere even more tense, more charged than before. This time, however, there was a different feeling in the air, a sense of anticipation, of hope, of defiance. Tristan, brought before the court, his hands still bound, but his head held high, his eyes filled with a steely determination, stood ready to face his accusers. Eleanor, seated in the gallery, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope, watched as Tristan began to speak, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the hall. He recounted his story, his capture, his years in captivity, his unwavering loyalty to the king, even in the face of torture and death. He spoke of the ancient treaty, of his refusal to sacrifice Eleanor, of his attempts to prevent a needless war. He exposed the lies, the misinterpretations, the conspiracy that had sought to frame him, to silence him. He named names, pointed fingers, revealing the treachery that had festered within the court. He spoke of his love for Eleanor, a love that had endured despite the years of separation, the pain, the betrayal. He spoke of his belief in justice, in honor, in the future of the kingdom. As he spoke, a hush fell over the hall, the courtiers listening intently, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and growing admiration. Even the king, seated upon his throne, his expression unreadable, seemed to be affected by Tristan's words, by his unwavering conviction. Then, Eleanor stepped forward, presenting the ancient treaty, the evidence of the king's flawed judgment, the proof of Tristan's innocence. She spoke of her own struggles, of her forced marriage, of her unwavering love for Tristan, of her belief in his honor. One by one, the lords and knights who had been swayed by their arguments, who believed in their cause, rose to their feet, voicing their support for Tristan, their condemnation of the king's actions. The tide had turned. The king, seeing the growing dissent, the crumbling of his authority, realized that he had lost. He could no longer deny the truth, no longer ignore the will of his people. He rose from his throne, his face pale, his voice trembling. I have been misled, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I have made mistakes. I have wronged Sir Tristan. He ordered Tristan's release, his exoneration. He dismissed Kellen from his service, ordering an investigation into the conspiracy that had sought to manipulate him. It was a victory, a hard-won victory, but a victory nonetheless. Tristan was free, his name cleared, his honor restored. As Eleanor and Tristan embraced, the cheers of the assembled courtiers echoing through the hall, they knew that the dawn of reckoning had arrived, not just for them, but for the entire kingdom. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Chapter 20. The Knight's Redemption. The aftermath of Tristan's exoneration was a period of profound change, of rebuilding and reconciliation. The king, humbled by his near-fatal misjudgment, embarked on a path of reform, seeking to regain the trust of his people, to restore the stability of the kingdom. He publicly apologized to Tristan and Eleanor, acknowledging their courage, their loyalty, their unwavering commitment to justice. He revoked the ancient treaty, declaring it null and void, freeing Eleanor from any obligation to marry against her will. Tristan, restored to his former position and honors, was appointed as the king's chief advisor, his wisdom and experience now valued, his counsel sought on matters of state. He used his influence to promote peace, to heal the divisions within the court, to ensure that such a miscarriage of justice would never happen again. Eleanor, no longer seen as a pawn in political games, but as a woman of strength and influence, returned to Blackwood, her lands and titles secure. She worked closely with Tristan, advising him, supporting him, their bond stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of adversity. They were finally free to be together, to love each other openly, without fear, without reservation. Their wedding, a simple ceremony held in the orchard at Winthorne, the place where their love had first blossomed, was a celebration of their enduring bond, of their triumph over adversity. The kingdom, too, began to heal, the wounds of the near war slowly closing. The threat from the neighboring kingdom receded, As the new leadership there, aware of the king's renewed strength and the unity of his people, chose to pursue a path of diplomacy rather than conflict. Tristan and Eleanor, though still involved in the affairs of the court, made Winthorne their home, their sanctuary. They spent their days together, riding through the countryside, tending to the land, sharing quiet moments of intimacy, their love a beacon of hope in a world that had so often seemed dark and unforgiving. They rebuilt Winthorne, not just the castle, but the community, fostering a spirit of unity, of cooperation, of mutual respect. They established schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions, seeking to improve the lives of their people, to create a more just and equitable society. Tristan, though still a warrior at heart, found a new purpose in his life, a new way to serve his kingdom, not through violence and bloodshed, but through wisdom and compassion. He had found his redemption, not on the battlefield, but in the arms of the woman he loved, in the service of his people. Eleanor, too, found a new sense of fulfillment, a new sense of purpose. She was no longer just a lady of the court, a pawn in political games, but a leader, a visionary, a woman who had fought for her freedom, for her love, and had won. As they stood together, hand in hand, looking out over the rolling hills of Winthorne, the sun setting in a blaze of glory, they knew that their journey had been long and arduous, filled with challenges and obstacles. But they had overcome them all, together. They had found their way back to each other, and they had found a future filled with hope, with love, with the promise of a better world. His gaze upon her was no longer a question, and hers was the answer. The night's regret had faded. Now there was only a bright, shared path. Epilogue. Years passed, seasons turning, painting the landscape of Winthorne in a continuous cycle of rebirth and renewal. Eleanor and Tristan, their love a constant flame amidst the changing tides of time, ruled wisely and justly, their names whispered with reverence throughout the kingdom. They had children, a son and a daughter, who inherited their parents' strength, their courage, and their unwavering commitment to justice. The children grew, strong and true, under the watchful eyes of their parents, learning the lessons of leadership, of compassion, of the enduring power of love. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, remained, a reminder of the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made. But they were no longer wounds, but badges of honor, symbols of their resilience, of their triumph over adversity. Tristan, his hair now streaked with silver, his body bearing the marks of his many campaigns, still rode out with his son, teaching him the ways of the warrior, the importance of honor, of duty, of protecting the innocent. But he also taught him the value of peace, of diplomacy, of seeking solutions through understanding rather than violence. Eleanor, her beauty undiminished by time, her eyes still shining with that same spark of defiance, of intelligence, continued to advise and support her husband, her wisdom and compassion a guiding light for their family, for their people. They often returned to the orchard, their sanctuary, the place where their love had first blossomed, where they had faced their greatest challenges, where they had found their way back to each other. They would sit beneath the ancient apple tree, their hands clasped, their hearts united, remembering the past, celebrating the present, dreaming of the future. The kingdom prospered under their joint guidance, their legacy one of peace, of justice, of a love that had conquered all. The story of Eleanor and Tristan, the Lady of Winthorne and the knight who had redeemed his regret, became a legend, whispered around firesides, sung by bards, passed down through generations. It was a story of courage, of loyalty, of the enduring power of love in a world often filled with darkness and despair. It was a story of hope, of redemption, of the possibility of finding happiness even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. And as the sun set on their lives, casting a golden glow over the land they had loved and served so well, Eleanor and Tristan knew that their story would live on, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, of the unwavering bond between two souls destined to be together forever. They closed their eyes, together, beneath a sky full of stars, their final breaths mingling as one. Their story was complete.